Drawing the daffodil is a bit more complicated than a simple cup flower such as a tulip. It not only has radial petals that make it an actinomorphic flower, but it has a unique cone section called a corona that is perched above the radial petals around. The rear view of the flower shows its spathe, a delicate onion-type skin. It is similar to bracts since it is designed to protect the bud stage. On close observation, inside the corona are the stamen and the pistil. For the sake of this demonstration, because it is video, I am going to be working from a photograph in order to make this easy to see. So once I've measured off all of my dimensions, I can start to block in the general shape of this flower. You will notice I have a nice ellipse here that fills in the external radial petals, and I have a column here to indicate the corona, and I have a second elliptical shape that identifies the ruffles, the way that they appear in real life. Also note that I have indicated the placement of the stem based on the fact that that stem comes up and meets with the center point of the corona itself. So that's where we begin. Now we can start to block in where our petals have to be formed, and this is done in a sketchy manner, more or less following the shape of the ellipse that we have created here. And you can do this very quickly by drawing in where shapes belong. Now, part of these radial petals on the outside, we don't see that sixth petal, but there are in fact 6 that surround the corona. Having a well-drawn line drawing on tracing paper, we can now transfer using a sharp 3 or 4H pencil. When tracing and transferring, you want to make sure that you transfer very carefully, going over the exact lines that you created when you did the original or this finished drawing. If you don't do that, there was no point in doing the finished drawing in the first place. But the whole idea here is to keep you from having to make corrections on the good drawing paper. The whole idea is to have everything resolved before getting to that stage. I have now transferred the entire flower to my drawing paper, but it's necessary for me at this point now to go over the transfer again so that I have a nice thin line. You can refer back to your drawing to see if there's anything that you left out, and you want to go over all of these parts so that you have, again, a very fine, light line. Do not draw heavy, making sure that you have your details correct. If something looks a little vague, you can go back to your original subject to see where you might want to make some adjustments. So I'm going to go over this whole thing again. The next thing I'm going to do is take my kneaded eraser and erase gently the transfer line so that all I have left is the line that I just drew to refine all the edges. So here's the reference for the daffodil. You will have a real life subject. But what I did was I took the photograph so that I would have a reference for values. I converted the reference to black and white. And what you'll see in the black and white is that the values appear much different than they do in the color. It's sometimes hard to tell what's light and what's dark in the color. Yes, we can see that the stem is dark, but we also get a tendency to think that this is as dark as this, which it is not. And that comes out in the black and white photograph. So this kind of tells you just how far to go with a particular value before you even start to render. And it is a very good reference for doing exactly that, is defining the true values that you need in order to make this drawing dynamic. You'll see that all of the shadows in the flower itself don't come anywhere near to the darkness that's in the stem and the spathe. So this will help you to make those measured decisions. Now I can use this as a cross-reference and I can start to render my daffodil. It is my recommendation that you always start with a heart pencil. I know I've said this in the lesson on tulips. Don't jump from a 4H down to an HB. You need to step this down gradually. So if you start with a 4H, then you go to a 3H, then you go to a 2H. Then you go to an H or an HB, and then you go to a B, and then you go to a 2B. Now, if you don't have all of these pencils, you definitely do need to have the 4H. You can go from 4H down to 2H and then to HB, but I would not make jumps any greater than that. So I'm going to start rendering by starting with my 4H pencil. As you can see, what I've been doing is filling in the darker areas first. This gives me a gauge as to how light to go when I have to do the light areas. So right now, I still have a ways to go. I'm going to put some more darks in here. And then I'm going to start to really darken down this area here. So that, because I don't want to touch this anymore, because now it seems to be dark enough for what I need. So in order to bring this forward, I'm going to have to darken this whole area. But even as I do that, there are going to be subtle variations in those darks so that I'm true to the value nature of the form. I am still working with a 4H pencil, and I will continue to do that until the 4H pencil will not give me any more darkness. That doesn't mean I press hard. It means I maintain the same pressure that I did with the first layer of graphite, because I don't want to impress the paper. So this is getting to the point here now where that's going to be it for the 4H. And I will switch over to the 3H as my next step. And I'm losing some of the detail that I had put in for the venation. But I'll be able to get that back later just by laying the tracing back over the top and adding a little bit more transfer pencil. All right, so I think this first layer is going to be my darkest area, and then I'm going to start to add the shadows. The stem itself will be even darker than this area because the spathe is a little bit lighter than the stem. Make sure you're very careful with your edges so you don't have blurry details. Make sure that you're always placing a piece of paper over your drawing where your hand rests so your hand doesn't pick up the graphite and start to smudge things. If you're creating an edge, make sure you blend it out so that it has a nice transition to it. And now it's time to start to look at where the venation is falling so that when you put your shadows in, you follow the venation. That does not mean you put the venation in itself right now. That's one of the last things you want to do. But you certainly, if you have a change of shape, you need to add that change of shape in the drawing so that you get this sense of dimension that you will only get by creating contrasting edges. I'll switch to 2H to get even darker on the stem. what I'm starting to indicate is the actual shape of the stem, which is not really round but more elliptical. So you'll get some light getting caught on this center edge to imply that there is a fold in that area because of the shape of the stem itself. So now I'm going to go back and work on the flower a bit more. And I may have to make that stem even darker as we progress, but I think we're going to leave it at this point and then go back to the 4H in order to do some of the rendering on the flower. I'm going to try and keep the value lighter than what I have here, but some areas will absolutely go a little darker. And especially down in these pockets, we can accentuate those dark pockets a little bit more than we might in order to create some dimension. I am applying a very light hand, and if that's not light enough, then I might switch over to a 5H in order to get the lightness that I want. I'm going to start with this petal, and you can see there's a very light area here on that petal and a very light area here. So I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to work the darker areas so that I have something to gauge against. I'm starting by filling in the entire petal first with a light layer, and then go back in and work the darker areas. So as you can see, now that I'm putting some of the values into the petals, it is really showing that I have to go much darker with the stem and the spathe. So I will be doing that as I'm working along here, just to keep the contrast going. And I'll be switching hardnesses of pencil depending on whether I'm working in a dark area or whether I'm working in a lighter area. But let's take a look at these values again. What's going on in this area? If we look at this entire area here, this entire area, even though some of it's light, is not as light as where the highlight is. So our highlight we have here, we have strong highlight on this petal, we have a little strong highlight here, and a little strong highlight here. That means everything else gets some value. We may have a little highlight here, but this again is not as light as this. This is not as light as this. So it's a matter of balancing out these darks and lights in order to get the dimension that you want. At this point, I have put some value in this inside cup of the cornea, and it's just a very light layer of number 5 pencil. You could probably do it with a 4 as well, but I have a 5. And I've made the stem quite dark by comparison, and I've put some shadow under this petal. If we look at our photo again, you can see this is a very light petal here, and this petal is darker next to it. Right now, mine is not quite as dark as it needs to be, and when you have different layers of values, the eye interprets them differently. So what's important here is that I have to make this a little darker, even though there's a light section in here, but this light section isn't anywhere near as light section as here, except for this area here. So I need to make this area here a little bit darker so that it balances better with this dark petal on this side. I've put in some of the shading for the conical shape of the corona here. And I'm going to put value on this whole thing just like I did here. Now what I'm going to have to do is darken in and create shadows for the folds that are caused by these ruffles. So that's going to be the next step in this process. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start filling in just with a light layer of number 5 on this entire petal, because there's no place on this petal that has a really strong highlight, and it has to be in balance with the highlight that's on this corona. You always want to start by filling out more or less evenly without getting too dark in one place or another in order to control how the values are going to ultimately turn out. So I filled in this entire petal with a number 5 nice flat layer, and now I'm going to go in still with my number 5, and I'm going to start to add some of the darks in where I think they need to be added, still working fairly lightly so that I have control over those values, and I will move to softer pencils as I progress. So what you see me doing right now is I'm putting this in. I'm going to put a shadow in this area. I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to indicate those veins, and then I'll wait and I'll go back to working for this section inside the corona. So I'm always balancing one aspect against another so that one area doesn't get too finished too quickly, and I have time to make modifications if I feel that they are necessary. So here's my finished drawing. Everything is pretty much where I need it to be. There's a nice contrast between the stem and the flower itself. The highlights in the flower are where they need to be, mostly in this area and along the edge of this front ruffle, and some highlight on this front petal here, and a few touches of highlight, although they're more subtle than what we have here, which is our main highlight, and we have our finished drawing.